It's pretty wild when you think about it. How do insurance companies and pension funds predict something as complex as a human lifespan? They're sitting on these absolute mountains of data, right? But that data is messy, it's chaotic, full of random spikes and dips. So today, we're going to demystify the incredible statistical process they use to turn all that noise into a clear, predictable pattern. It's a fascinating art and science called graduation. Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll get into why raw data is just so difficult to work with. Then we'll explore the art of smoothing it all out and the three main tools actuaries have for the job. After that, we'll see how you pick the right tool for the right situation, and finally, we'll connect it all back to why this process really matters in our day-to-day lives. All right, let's dive right in with the fundamental challenge here. The data itself, well, it isn't nearly as clean as you'd hope. I mean, that's a totally fair question, isn't it? If you've got millions and millions of data points, you'd think the overall trend would just, pop right out at you. But in the real world, the raw numbers are often a complete jumble. Yeah, the technical terms for it are crude and noisy. The best way to think about it is like trying to look at a really grainy, low-resolution photo, or maybe listening to a radio station that's just full of static. The real picture, the actual song is in there somewhere, but all those random fluctuations, all that statistical noise is hiding it. The entire goal is to filter out that static and find the clear signal. So how in the world do you clean up that mess? How do you find that signal? Well, you do it through an elegant process called graduation. At its heart, graduation is really the art of smoothing. It's about taking all those jagged, crude data points and carefully fitting a smooth curve through them. A curve that reveals the true underlying story of what's happening. And that new, smoother line, that's what becomes your reliable model for making predictions about the future. And here is the absolute key to the whole thing. This entire process is a balancing act, a fundamental trade-off. On one side, you want your new line to stick really close to the original data points. That's called adherence. But if you stick too closely, your new line will be just as jagged and chaotic as the raw data you started with. On the other side, you want a beautiful, perfectly smooth curve. But if you make it too smooth, you might accidentally iron out really important real patterns in the data, like a sudden increase in mortality at a certain age. And honestly, this quote just nails it. It perfectly captures the essence of the challenge. Graduation isn't about finding some single perfect answer. It's always a compromise. It's about striking just the right balance between fitting the data you have and creating a curve that's actually smooth and usable. What that right balance is, well, that completely depends on what you need the numbers for. So how do experts actually perform this delicate balancing act? Well, they have an actuary's toolkit, and it's got three primary methods inside. Let's take a look at each one. So inside that toolkit, you're going to find three main approaches. You can fit a single mathematical formula to the data, you can use a pre-existing template, or you can use something a lot more flexible called a spline function. And as you'll see, each one is perfect for a different kind of job. Okay, tool number one, a parametric formula. This is the most direct approach. It's like searching for a single, elegant mathematical equation, one law, that can describe the entire pattern of mortality across every age. Some famous ones you might have heard of are Gompertz's or Makeham's laws. This method works great when you have a gigantic data set, like the entire population of a country, where you're pretty sure a strong, consistent pattern exists. The second tool is kind of like using a pre-made template or a stencil. What you do is you take a really reliable, high-quality mortality table that someone else has already built, that's your standard table. And then you find a pretty simple formula to just stretch it or shrink it or shift it around so that it fits your own much smaller data set. This is absolutely perfect for when you just don't have enough of your own data to build a trustworthy model from scratch. Now for the third method, and this is where things get really cool and flexible, spline functions. I want you to picture a spline as a flexible ruler, one that you can physically bend to trace a really complex shape. Mathematically, it's just a series of smaller curves that are all joined together at key points called knots. By deciding where to place those knots, you're basically telling the ruler where to bend. This makes splines fantastic at capturing unique, quirky features that a single rigid formula would totally miss, like the infamous accident hump, that tragic but very real spike in mortality we see for young men in their late teens and early 20s. Okay, so you've got three different tools in the toolkit. How do you decide which one to grab? Well, it really just comes down to the kind of data you have and what you're trying to accomplish with your analysis. The decision-making process is actually pretty logical. If you're working with a massive national data set, you're going to build a brand new model, probably using a parametric formula or a spline. But let's say you're working with a much smaller data set, like a single company's pension plan. Then you'd use a standard table. This lets you borrow strength, as they say, from a much bigger, more reliable data source. And again, if your data has those weird but important shapes, splines are definitely your go-to tool. Let's make this even more real. Imagine you're an actuary with two jobs. For task A, a medium-sized pension scheme with pretty limited data, referencing a standard table is the smartest move you can make. You're leveraging the solid pattern from a much bigger, more credible study. But for task B, analyzing an entire developed country's population, you've got all the data you could ever want. So you're going to build a brand new model from the ground up, making a parametric formula or a spline the obvious choice. So we've been pretty deep in the statistical weeds here. But why does any of this abstract number crunching actually matter? Well, it matters because it has a very, very real impact on our finances and on our society as a whole. At the end of the day, all those smooth graduated mortality rates that come out of this whole process, they directly influence two of the biggest financial industries there are, life insurance and pensions. Just think about it for a second. For life insurance companies, you absolutely need premium rates that increase smoothly and predictably as people get older. You can't have a situation where, because of some random quirk in the data, the rate for a 45-year-old is suddenly cheaper than for a 44-year-old. That makes no sense. For pensions and annuities, the risk is flipped. If they underestimate how long people are going to live, they could literally run out of money. And it goes beyond that. Governments rely on these graduated tables to plan for things like Social Security and public health. This process is, without a doubt, the bedrock of long-term financial and social planning. So that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. For centuries, we've used these tools to find the story hidden deep inside the data. But today, we're living longer and longer lives, and we're generating more data than at any point in human history. The challenge is only getting bigger, which makes you wonder, what new tools will we need to invent to find the true story in the numbers of tomorrow?